Hi, this is Mike from Mike's Unboxing Reviews and How To, and on today's video we're taking a look at the BIOS on the MSI B560M Pro VDH WiFi, Microstar International model name MS7D18. Today's date is Monday the 17th of October, as you can see from the top left corner, and this is the easy mode. So if you're going into the BIOS for the first time, this is very likely to be the screen that you'll see. So we'll start from the top left hand corner. So we've got options here for time and date. We're connected to the Ethernet, so it's picking up that. You've also got your CPU speed reported, DDR speed reported. We've already set that XMP. And over here we've got our core temperatures, motherboard temperatures, vCore, DDR voltage, etc. BIOS mode, CSM or UEFI. And over here we've got model names, processor type. So in this particular edition of the video, we're using the Intel 11th Gen Intel Core i5-11400F, which is currently at 2.6 GHz. Memory size is registered as being 16 gigs, and our current BIOS version is this one here, which is from the 14th of the 7th, 2022. Underneath that we've got our boot priority, which you can pick those up and slide them around. So if you want to set your USB drive to boot as your primary, you can do. So that is pretty much drag and drop. Over here we've got Creator Genie. If you've got a processor that supports it for overclocking, such as a K series, then you can click on there and it will give you a little bit of a boost to your system. Next up we've got our XMP profiles, which you can choose through. So we've got XMP profile number 1 enabled. Underneath this, in easy mode, you've got options for CPU, memory, storage, fan info and help. Underneath that you've got M-Flash, CPU cooler tuning, hardware monitor, and in this central panel here we've got the CPU fan fail warning control. You've also got the option to turn on ERP ready, HD audio controller, which you can enable or disable with the slider there, EHCI or RAID for your onboard controllers, so you can choose whether you're using it as a regular kind of SATA type drive or a RAID setup, and also easy LED control, which you can enable or disable. That will essentially turn off all of the LEDs and RGB functionality of the motherboard should you wish to. CPU section, obviously telling you about your processor, if you've got hyper-threading enabled, turbo boost enabled, and virtualization. So if you're doing some sort of virtualization, you want to make sure that that is enabled. Execute disable bit as well, that is telling you it's enabled. So that is pretty much straightforward for the main screen. You can go into each one of these and find more information. It is slightly limited and is more for reporting rather than actually making any adjustments. In storage it tells you what drives are connected, so if you're having issues with certain drives not being detected, then obviously you can investigate that further. Fan information, you can go in and actually, in this section you can actually make changes, so you can change from being either PWM, voltage control, and also you can change the settings for your individual curves, all that kind of good stuff. It tells you the current fan speeds, temperatures, etc., so that's pretty good. You've got the help section, so it tells you how to basically navigate through this kind of mini application. And again, it tells you about Creator Genie, so if it is off or grayed out, it means that it's disabled. If it's on, then obviously yes, it will give you a little bit of overclock, but like I said, non-K CPUs are not supported for Creator Genie. Other things of note, so for quick access, CPU cooler tuning, if you're finding your processor is throttling somewhat hard, then you can click on CPU cooler tuning, and this will normally come up the first time you power up the system anyway, so it will tell you if you're using the standard included cooler, then you should use the box cooler, and this will limit your power limit to 65 watts for the primary and 115 for the secondary. If you're using a tower air cooler, then it's going to be limited to 100 and 115, and the same for a water cooler, so not really a great deal of difference between those two. So there we go, click escape there, and also you've got hardware monitor, so you can check out all the information. Basically it goes into this section, which we'll take a look at in more depth a little bit later. So that is the main screen. So if you want to get a bit more advanced and see some of the other settings, then we can click on this up here, or you can tap F7 and it will switch to the next screen, which is this one here. Again, very similar sort of layout. The top section is pretty much identical. Also as well, if you want to take screenshots and save them to a USB stick, if you've got one plugged in, you can press F12. That will take screenshots. So if you're maybe trying to show somebody what your settings are in BIOS and you've got no way of screen capturing, then you can use that to take a picture USB. We've also got this bit here, which is basically a search. So if you type in something such as XMP, it will go to it and you can actually go to it straight away, or just click on it and verify settings, etc. Language options in the top there, and in the top we've got our X. So if you click on X, it will give you the option to save your settings and reset. We don't want to do that quite yet. So going through again, so let's go through settings first of all. So first of all, you've got your system status. You can navigate this with keyboard, mouse, whatever you want to do. So I'm going to click on enter there. You can put in system dates, etc., and it gives you more information. Pretty much similar to what we've seen already about what is connected, BIOS dates, all that kind of good stuff. If you go into advanced, you've got a lot more settings here. So this is going to be for setting up things like your PCI Express settings. So we go to the top one. So you've got your link speeds, max speeds, all that kind of stuff. Your PCI latency timers, things that you may want to enable in here, should you have support for it. It's going to be things like resizable bar, so if you've got an Intel system, and maybe you've gone out and bought yourself a new A750 or A770 or A380 even, then you can enable resizable bar, which will give you a little bit of performance boost in those particular GPUs, and also with NVIDIA and AMD ones as well. You've also got your virtualization support for the I/O, and also you've got your native PCI Express enable and native ASPM. Essentially, I would leave those as they are unless you have a need to change them. You can, if you want to, look at those in more detail for the individual ports on the motherboard. Something else you might want to potentially do is if you've got your PCI Express slot 1, maybe if you've got an older GPU, then you can change it down to Gen 3 if you're having problems, or if you're using a riser card, that sort of thing. If you're not entirely sure, feel free to reach out to us in the comments section, or drop us a line, mike@mikesunboxing.com, or join our Discord and I'll try and give you some advice for your specific system. M.2s, again, you can choose whether you're using the CPU lanes or your PCI or PCH from the chipset. So if you're using a older 10th gen CPU on this board, which doesn't support PCI Express M.2 lanes via the CPU, then you can change that manually, which is quite handy. Ours is set to CPU because we're currently running with an 11th gen processor. ACPI, so we've got options there for power ID blinking and your CPU over temperature alert. Might as well leave those as are. Integrated peripherals, so you've got your VGA detection, you've got that to auto or ignore. I would leave it as auto, so if you've a processor with integrated graphics and you're also using a graphics card, it will detect all of it, whatever comes up on the system. Onboard LAN you can enable or disable, that is for the onboard Realtek RTL 8125, I believe it is, the 2.5 gigabit Ethernet. Your LAN option ROM, so you can choose to boot from ROM if you've got that set up in your system. Network stack, so that is for optimizing UEFI, choose to enable or disable. And your onboard CNVI module control, you can choose that for auto detect, that's for onboard Wi-Fi and your Bluetooth. So I would leave that set to auto. This board does have both those features enabled as default, so I would leave that set as auto. Or you can disable it, so if you want to disable your onboard Wi-Fi and disable your onboard Bluetooth, then you can disable that should you wish to. But I'll leave that to auto. Same sort of thing for your SATA drive, so you can choose AHCI or you can choose Optane if you want to. A little bit of a dying thing now these days, but you go hot plug, that's disabled. That'll probably be disabled for most people. There's no real need for SATA hot plug these days. Last one is going to be your HD audio controller, which you can enable or disable. I would leave it enabled, obviously, if you want to use your onboard sound. USB configuration, so AHCI handoff and legacy USB support. I would leave these both enabled personally, just so that if you're trying to use an older USB device, maybe you're trying to do BIOS flashes, that sort of stuff, it's always handy to have it. And also it means that your older things like keyboard and mouse will initialize before the system is actually posted and booting up, all that kind of stuff. USB port control, so if you want to disable specific ports on the motherboard, you can go ahead and do that. I've left all of them enabled currently. Super I/O configuration, so this is for your serial COM port if you want to enable or disable. I've left mine as disabled because generally don't use it. Power management setup, so ERP ready. If you turn on ERP, chances are that it's going to go into low power mode, so that is going to reduce the system's overall ability to kind of use more power. If you're in an area which requires ERP compliance, then obviously do enable that. Also as well, if you turn on ERP, things like powered USB ports when the system is in standby or shutdown, it's going to disable those as well. So if you want to actually turn off your USB port power whilst the system is off, make sure you enable ERP. Restore AC after power loss, again, entirely up to you. Power off, power on, or last state. I generally leave it as power off. System power fault protection, I'll leave that as enabled. I would recommend doing that. And you'll get notifications on the system screen should there be any problems with your power supply or power coming into the system. And also you've got this bit here, so USB standby power at S4 or S5. So that's when your system isn't fully switched off but is in some form of sleep mode or low power mode. You can choose to have the USB standby power on or off if you maybe got your system in a bedroom and you're trying to get to sleep at night and your system's in standby, but your USB is powering your mouse and your keyboard and all the RGBs are lit up, then you might want to switch that to disabled. Next one is going to be your option for CSM or UEFI mode. For most modern systems, I would recommend using UEFI. Most components these days will support that. If you're using slightly older peripherals, maybe an old graphics card, or you've got older hard drives which were installed prior and they don't support GPT, then you may want to enable UEFI or CSM to be compatible with older stuff. So wake up events, you can choose wake up events, so you can wake up by the BIOS, real time clock alarm, PCI, Wi-Fi, all that sort of stuff. And you can resume by USB devices, mouse, keyboard, all that kind of stuff. You can set those to enabled or disabled as you wish. Secure Erase Plus, that is for basically erasing SSDs, and then you've got the same sort of thing. So your NVMe self-test, you can test your drive should you wish to. I don't think anyone ever does that. I don't think there's any real need to do it, but it's there as an option should you wish to. Boot options, so this is something you may want to configure. So your full screen logo display, you may want to disable that for some reason, so it doesn't show the MSI logo on boot. You also got go to BIOS, which is something you can enable. So if you press the power button for 4 seconds when you're turning on the system to start with, it will boot into the BIOS screen rather than going into Windows directly. Can be quite handy if you want to do some configuration changes. Boot up numlock, pretty self-explanatory. Info block select. That is to do with your graphics card, so if you're having problems with your GPU, you can choose unlock or lock. I would leave it unlocked. Post beep, so if you want to have a beep when your system boots up to say that it's done, if you've got a speaker connected to the motherboard, you can choose that enabled or disabled. You've also got auto clear CMOS. This is actually quite handy as well, so if the system just basically cannot boot for some reason, it will go through a few cycles like it does with memory training. And if it just gets to the point where it just simply cannot get to the boot process, it will automatically clear the CMOS back to the factory defaults after a specified time. Also, you've got MSI Fast Boot, so that is basically making your system boot quicker. If you do that, when you boot up, it won't actually detect USB, PS2 or SATA devices whilst during that initial post part. And also you've got Fast Boot, and you can use that enabled or disabled. I'm actually going to disable that. I generally don't find that to be much help at all. Next up we've got our boot order, so again if you don't want to use the slider at the top, which is this one up here, you can use the boot options here, so you click on there and you can boot from selected devices. Obviously if you're doing just a normal system, you want it to boot from your Windows Boot Manager, but if you want to set it so it boots from a CD or DVD or USB disk beforehand, then you can choose all that. If you want to disable the options, of course you can do that as well. Disable these should you want to. So I'm not sure if it actually makes the system quicker or not. Maybe it does, I'm not entirely sure. If you've got more than one drive connected, then you may want to go into the BBS priorities, so that's going to be your boot drive priorities. So if you've got maybe 3 NVMe drives or 2 NVMe drives or a bunch of SATAs or HDDs, you can go in here and specify a specific drive to boot from. Next one's save and exit. Obviously you don't want to do that quite yet, but that is what you, if you want to do that, save and exit, you can choose from discard your changes. So if you're just having a play, you can discard the changes you've made. You can also save changes should you wish to. Save changes, discard changes, restore defaults, etc. So if you're having problems with the system, restore defaults is quite useful. You can do that and it will restore all of your settings back to the factory defaults for the particular BIOS version you have installed. And also boot override, so if you're doing a one-time deal and you just want to quickly install Windows for the first time, if you've got your USB drive installed and with its Windows operating system on it, you can choose a drive, but obviously ours isn't showing there because we don't have one installed currently. So that is pretty much it for settings. We can go out into OC settings, so this is overclocking. We're in expert mode currently. There's 2 options for expert and normal. It just gives you reduced settings. Depending on the processor, you may or may not have some options grayed out here or enabled. You've got CPU ratio apply mode, so you can choose for your kind of overclocking settings, whether it does a turbo ratio, offset, all core is probably what I would leave it to. That is the factory default. Also your CPU ratio, so if you are overclocking, this particular processor won't allow it. It is kind of stuck at 2.6 gigahertz. That is the factory speed, but you can, if you want to, type in something here. So let's try 3200, and yeah, it doesn't like it, so it'll go to, there we go. Yeah, if you type in 32, it'll add the zeros in for you. So that are our adjusted speeds, but those won't hold because this is a non-K processor. So if you put in a 0, it will just change it back to the automatic. Advanced CPU configuration, so this is where you can enable things like your hyperthreading, your active cores, your C states. You also enable your turbo boost, all that kind of stuff. Long duration power limit, so I've actually increased this. Normally this is set to 100 as default. You can set it to pretty much whatever you want and it will just boost to whatever it can. Let's try 120. Yeah, seems to have taken that. Your long duration maintained boosts, you can choose how long it actually boosts for. So again, the default is set to 8 seconds for this particular processor, but you can choose more if you want to, and if you've got the thermal headroom to be able to do it. Short duration power limit, again, you've got all those settings you can change if you want to. CPU current limit, so you can up the current limit from 210 up to whatever you want. It probably won't make a great deal of difference because the system will be intelligent. It will only go to what it can actually physically do anyway. Your CPU light load control, you can choose that from normal or advanced. Go into advanced, you've got your AC load line and your DC load line. So this part is you can go change your TVB point temperatures, offsets, all that kind of stuff. So turbo ratio at certain frequencies. Again, if you've got a locked processor, you may not be able to change this at all. I would leave this alone unless you know exactly what you're doing. This is pretty much advanced stuff. But setting it to auto, it should try and do the best it possibly can anyway, so that's absolutely fine. Your DMI link speed, so that is your link between the processor and the chipset. So if you set it to auto, that is going to be the best. I don't know why you'd want to choose anything less than that anyway. It will default to Gen 3 anyway, because that is kind of what the processor can do. Intel speed shift technology, you can enable or disable or leave it to auto. I would leave that to auto. And AVX support, you can choose whether you have disabled AVX support. So in some instances you might want to disable AVX because of the extra thermal headroom for certain tasks. I've left mine as auto. Your ring ratio, you can choose to change that there for the ring ratios if you want to modify those. Currently we're at 2200 megahertz. CPU cooler tune-in, we've gone through that before. Again, you can choose whichever cooler is appropriate for your system. Again, depending on what processor you've got installed, those limits will be slightly different. DRAM, this is where you're going to want to enable your XMP profile if you don't do it from the top. So you can do it from XMP at the top here, or you can choose in here. So you can see that our settings are loaded in. So we are using DDR4 3600 CL18, and it seems to have dialed in those settings. You can choose enabled or disabled. Then you've got your DRAM clocks, DRAM frequency, so you can manually choose that should you wish to. You've also got your memory try it, so this you can try specific types of memory speed or settings. So if you want to try getting your CAS latency down or maybe up your frequencies, you can do that in here. DRAM timing mode, so you can choose whether it's automatic, linked or unlinked. So link is going to link it to the speed of the bus. If you have unlink, it's going to go basically do whatever it can do. Auto is probably your best settings here. Memory fast boot, this is set to auto at the moment, so this is for memory training. So it's set to auto as default. You can choose disabled, enabled, no training or slow training. Sometimes for certain memory modules, if they're not liking your XMP settings or not dialing in properly, you might want to choose slow training. Generally auto is going to be your best setting. Next up, we've got our voltage settings. So you've got digital power, so you can go in and change your load line calibrations, and you've got option mode 1 is going to be kind of like the highest performing. Mode 8 is going to be the lowest. So I would generally choose auto. Again, depending on what processor you've got and what overclocking you're doing, you may want to change that. Same with that one there. Then you've got your CPU core voltage monitor. So you've got VCC or you've got socket sense. Default is VCC, and you've got your offset modes for the voltage. You can choose those and insert your specific voltages manually there should you wish to. DRAM voltage as well, so if you want to up the voltage, if you've got RAM which again is misbehaving, you can up the voltage a little bit should you need to. And then you've got CPU memory change detect. That's pretty handy. So if you change the CPU, it'll come up on the system saying, yep, you've changed the CPU. Do you want to go into the BIOS and configure it? So that can be quite handy. And CPU specifications, we've seen that already, so that's just the same thing again there. Memory Z, so you can get details about your actual RAM chips. So again, you see this is a V-color stick in this particular slot, and you can see the settings which the EEPROM is reporting back to the system. Further information, you can do that for whichever sticks are installed. I've only got 2 memory sticks installed, so it's only showing 2 here. CPU features, so your CPU ID maximum, you can choose that. Intel virtualization, so if you want to use virtualization, you can have that enabled or disabled. Well, we're not, so I'll turn that off. VT detect, you can enable or disable. Hardware prefetcher, your cache line prefetch. AES instructions, and your CFG lock. You can choose to have those enabled or disabled. And that is pretty much it for the OC section. Again, you can go into this in a lot of depth should you wish to, but depending on the processor, you may or may not be able to access some features, and some features may not lock in. Next one is going to be mFlash, so if you want to flash your BIOS from within the BIOS itself, click on there, it will reboot the system and go into flash mode. We'll show you that in a separate video because it takes ages. Next one is going to be your OC profile, so you can save and load profiles in here, or you can upload them from a USB stick and all that kind of stuff. If you're messing around with overclocking profiles and performance, you can do that. Next one's going to be your hardware monitor. This is what most of you are probably going to want to know about. So in here you can choose all your settings. So for this one, your CPU is currently in PWM mode for the fan, and we're in smart mode, so you can move these around, drag them around to set your particular fan curves. Also reports the speed setting there, and pump settings, and for the other 2 fan headers. So if we want to change anything there, currently our fans are DC controlled, but you can change them to PWM should you want to, and you can hear them ramping up straight away because it's a different setting. We'll leave that on DC. Again, you can change all your fan settings here, adjust the curves, and get it so it sounds just right to you. Also, you can choose kind of what it's monitoring, so you can choose whether it's monitoring the CPU core, the system, the MOS or MOS, the chipset, or the CPU socket. I'll leave it to CPU core, and you've got your step up times and step down times. So yeah, pretty self-explanatory in there. You can choose also all full speed, set all back to defaults, or set all cancel. And then underneath there you've got your options, or readouts rather, for your temperatures, and a bar chart of the same thing underneath it. So yeah, it's pretty straightforward stuff for hardware monitor. And the last one is going to be security. This is probably going to be more relevant now than what it would be a little while back because of obviously Windows 11 and TPM and all that kind of stuff. So you've got your U-key, which you can enable or disable. You've got trusted computing, so that's your TPM. So TPM 2.0 device is found, and the firmware version tells you about the device that's selected, etc. You can enable or disable certain banks. I would leave this as is. Generally, you won't want to change this unless you're changing your motherboard, or maybe you're changing your processor, reinstalling an operating system, and you want to clear your TPM keys, all that kind of stuff. But that is pretty much it for there. So if you need to enable or disable TPM, just go to the top one, Security Device Support, and choose Enabled. Or obviously disabled if you don't want to use it. Next one's chassis intrusion configuration. So this is so if basically if the chassis is intruded or opened and the switch is connected, then you can get it to send a message on the screen. And the next one's secure boot. Again, Windows 11 is going to want this, so secure boot you can choose to be enabled or disabled. Currently we're on Windows 10 on this machine, so secure boot is currently disabled. If you want to install Windows 11, you'll need to turn on secure boot. And you also have your secure boot mode, so you've got standard or custom. So if you've got a standard image that you want to be able to enroll or to be able to boot from, you can choose that there. And you can also do things like delete all your secure boot variables, delete all your keys, all that kind of stuff, install factory keys or custom keys, all that kind of stuff. Leave that back to standard. And it's saying there, do you want to install the factory defaults? Press yes, so yes we do. And no, we don't want to reset quite yet. So yep, that is it for there, and I think that is going to be pretty much it. So yeah, I think we've pretty much covered everything on there. The main things really for most people are going to be going in and doing your XMP profile, going into settings in your advanced, and doing kind of maybe changes in there should you wish to, resizable bar, set that to enabled, all that kind of stuff. But yeah, I think that is going to be pretty much it. So that is a quick tour there of the BIOS for the B560M Pro VDH WiFi. I've been Mike, this is Mike's Unboxing Reviews and How To, and hopefully we'll catch you in the next one. Thanks for watching.